Welcome to episode 3 of Unmuted, a podcast on 5FM where we unpack the nuances of gender-based violence in our nation. Today we have a special guest, the National Coordinator at the National Shelter Movement of South Africa, Anisa Moosa. Thank you so much for joining us, Anisa.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and good day to everybody.
It's a big one, and I'm glad we're actually having it around, 16 days of activism, because I think today is more about the nitty-gritties, and it's an important one for survivors, with my first question being the declaration of GBV-F as a national disaster. What kind of impact will that have on society, but particularly for survivors?
I think the impact is expected to be great. I think it draws attention to the crisis, the importance of addressing gender-based violence with statistics being so high. Just off the cuff, we have 1 in every 3 women having experienced gender-based violence. In the first quarter of the year, we have just under 1,000 women having been killed, and almost 11,000 women having been assaulted. So the statistics are high. Shutdown or declaring it a national disaster will definitely draw attention to it, in something that really needs to be drawn attention to. The other element that I want to raise is especially vulnerable groups, women, children, people living with disabilities, especially now in South Africa with our 24-hour shelter helpline. We're seeing a lot of asylum seekers, refugees, trafficking in persons is a big thing. So you have a lot of displaced people. And also your LGBTQIA plus communities are some of your marginalized and vulnerable people. But I think also it will draw attention to the systemic failures, which are when we look at the justice system, we look at law enforcement, how women are being traumatized and victimized even when they reach out for help, when they're not getting the assistance that they need, when cases are not being timeously processed or effectively processed, perpetrators are not being held accountable. So those are some of the things that draws attention to the fact that there's an urgency. It's definitely an emergency, something that can't be neglected or avoided.
Oh, I think you've touched on so many powerful points already when you talk about the response that's necessary legislatively. But I think also my question is about sheltering specifically and why it's so important in this fight. You're speaking about people who are displaced that are from other groups. It's not just women. It's not just children. The LGBTQI plus community that also is in crisis to an extent. How can we understand better the vitality of shelters and temporary accommodation?
Okay, so I'm glad that you mentioned the words temporary accommodation, because we always say that shelters are more than just accommodation. They actually save lives, and they also create opportunities for transformation. Now, why we bring that up is when we understand the role of sheltering, it's a gateway service. So again, and I'm going to now and again refer to our 24-hour shelter placement service. And I look at that as a gateway because it accesses sheltering. But what sheltering does is it allows women to heal, to recover. It gives them an opportunity to kind of rebuild their lives. Shelters provide psychosocial services. When we talk about access services, what services are we talking about? We're talking about legal, maybe if they require medical, mental health services, depending on the resources that are available. And that brings me to another point, which I don't know how much time we'll have to go into, but I'm sure you've heard over the last couple of years, especially here in Gauteng, shelters have struggled with funding. We've been going through shelter funding crisis, and first of all, we don't have enough shelters in South Africa. And then when we have funding crises like these, resources are limited. So why I brought that up is when we talk about services and we talk about resources, we look at accessibility. So even in a shelter, depending on what funding or resources are available to the shelter, they can provide better, efficient, and what we call survivor-centered services. And that then implies comprehensive services. And also one of the things that we've been trying to drive is standardizing services. So why is access imbalanced or not equal for different people, depending again on the region, like your rural or remote areas as opposed to urban, but then they're also dense. So, there's so many factors to take into consideration. But to paint the picture around what sheltering does is that it allows women to be able to move forward. We also try to provide programs for them, educational programs, life skills, learning, basic things like healthy relationships, self-awareness, self-growth. So it's very comprehensive, and that's what it should be.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm glad you started touching on the changes in funding for NPOs this year. Anything from registration, the access to the barrier of access rather has now been kind of increased for a lot of NPOs. And I would love to know how the NSM has been affected, if at all, by these changes, or maybe some of the projected effects that you are seeing might come as a result of the changes.
Okay, so it has been devastating for a lot of people. It's been dragging on for quite some time. The NSM has put out a lot of media releases, as you know. Over that time, we've worked with an organization called the Gauteng Care Crisis Committee to try and engage with the Department of Social Development. But when we look at the impact, again, when we look at the observations from the helpline, you can see already we've moved in Gauteng particularly from 22 and 23 affiliated shelters down to like 13, which is a big chunk of shelters that have reduced. What happens then is shelters are either closing down or they're suspending services. When that happens, we have to turn survivors away. They lose trust and confidence in the system. Staff sometimes have to be retrenched. Managers can't make operational decisions long term because it's a very confusing, unsettling time. Services are halted, but even if you look at the bigger picture, when we say survivors are turned away, what are the implications of that? And the implications are that we continue to leave them in feeling threatened and unsafe. The risk is perpetuated. Violence is perpetuated. They have to stay in relationships because they have nowhere to go. It's not a pretty picture at all. And that is why, again, coming back, if you're talking about declaring gender-based violence a national disaster, we can see that there's grave implications for survivors. And what is it? If our voices are not loud enough or they're not being heard, then we have to make a bigger noise.
Absolutely. It is exactly that. I mean, I'm going to come back to the sheltering, but I'd like to ask, I think, maybe on a more intellectual level, the kind of work we need to do mentally to really fully grasp GBV, but in the South African context, hierarchical structures kind of seep and bleed into communities. And when we talk about gender disparity, it's still something that affects us in our households, and it kind of perpetuates domestic violence and sexist behaviors. So how do we conscientize, how do we sensitize communities in gender studies and making people understand that passive sexist behaviors affect and contribute to the overall discourse of GBV?
Just on a superficial level, I think superficial but not so superficial is the understanding that whenever we speak or we refer, do we really listen to what we're saying? Are we conscious of our thought processes and the messages that we convey to people around us? And that includes young people. And I think when you talk about conscientizing or changing, and we talk about gender norms or stereotypes based on patriarchal thinking. So it's a long-term process. It's something we have to start challenging, and I think that the key message is about respect for all, right? No matter what your definition of, let's say, for example, feminism is, or what is it like, what your perception is of being female or male, or whatever the case may be, whatever associations or characteristics you want to associate. But I think the message is about respecting everybody. But I think in terms of initiatives and some of the things that we could look at is integrating gender norm discussions, even in platforms like working with parents. And I think that's also where it starts, because when we look at children and the kind of spaces, and that brings me to another conversation around, before we started the interview, we started speaking about the intergenerational element of gender-based violence, and even how both boys and girls are affected by gender-based violence, and what are the long-term implications when they grow up, their life choices, their behavior patterns, their thinking. So when we talk about prevention also, it has to start from very, very young age. And we can do that by also addressing parents. I think then we also need to work with, and I suppose the message is that you have to work with people at different developmental stages, different age groups, and teens and youth through various platforms. Social media is a big thing now. I know AI is, we attended, quite a few members of the NSM attended the 5th World Conference on Women's Shelters in Australia in September. Big message there was on AI. Then, like I mentioned, we have to challenge gender stereotypes, engage communities, and I mentioned social media as well. Workshop topics like, what constitutes a healthy relationship? Do we know what constitutes a healthy relationship? And then positive masculinity is a concept that's being used more frequently now these days, and dialogues to engage men and boys. So, like I said, it's a long-term process, something that's going to take a lot of time. We need to start watching what we say, how we engage.
Oh, very powerful stuff. I mean, personally, on a U level, you work with GBV survivors quite closely. What are some of those life lessons that you learn and employ in your own life from working with survivors?
Okay, so when I read that, when as I'm listening even to the question, I know that again, we talk about the reflections and it goes a bit deep. But I think the importance of listening, the importance of compassion and empathy. And I mentioned the word survivor-centered. And I think when we talk about survivor-centeredness, it means being able to understand what the needs of survivors are. And you'll see that as time goes on, and again, observations from the helpline, but even as a social worker by profession, cases are complex. Survivors have very specific needs, whether there's mental health issues, whether there's addiction, substance addiction as a coping or a contributing factor. So survivor needs are very specific. They specialize in going back again to the inadequate resources and funding. How do we cater for those? So coming back to your question is about understanding survivor needs and then listening and showing empathy. Then appreciation for resilience and strength, building to motivate, to give hope. Trauma-informed interventions, because we cannot remove the element of the trauma that people experience, that survivors experience. And I think almost everyone goes through difficult times, whether it's a tragedy, whether it's a loss, whether it's a grief. And then sometimes survivors experience that happening together. So that, and then cultural sensitivity, which is something that you mentioned, and a respect for all, listening to how we address people, being culturally sensitive, getting to know people, asking questions, engaging with them, making them feel good. People love to be listened to, right? Then empowerment in taking control of one's life. And I think that's elements of responsibility, ownership, being able to make decisions, informed decisions, being able to stand up for oneself, and removing oneself from some kind of vulnerability, then setting healthy boundaries, ensuring your relationships are healthy and balanced. But I mentioned this, being able to recognize a healthy relationship, knowing what constitutes a healthy relationship. And then very important, and I think, again, going back to our conversation a little bit earlier about the blesses, is about building healthy self-images. Because when we know our self-worth, then you can recognize and understand when you're not being treated well. And that, again, then leads into being able to identify healthy relationships. So your relationship with yourself is important. And then, and I mentioned, being able to make informed decisions.
Sure. I think those are really great lessons that apply to everyone in life in general. Bringing us back to the sheltering process, I think I have the biggest question about whether perpetrators logistically directly make it difficult for survivors to seek help. Have there been cases? And in those cases, is it law enforcement's job to step up? Is the NSM able to intervene in some way? Or are we leaving it all to family, friends, and community members?
I think, like we talk about the 16 days of activism, and we know that 16 days goes, it should be 365 days. In the same way, gender-based violence is something that not affects only survivors, only perpetrators. It affects all of us. And I think, again, that's going back to your very first question about the national disaster, is that it affects us as a country, right? So when we look at gender-based violence, I think we need to understand that each of us also, there's the collective action, but there's also the individual action. It's important for us to know what our rights are and the processes of claiming those. So when you mentioned law enforcement, if I go to a police station, I don't know what the law says. I don't know what the procedure. Someone can tell me, no, you're not supposed to do this. And then like, oh, okay, I don't know, pack my things, go back. But in the meantime, I can stand up, but I don't know that, right? So I think it's important for people to know what their rights are so that they can act on them. Then also the National Shelter Movement also put out, so we have what we call safety guidelines, and it's something that we want to do in a webinar in the next few months and share with community members on what is it that they can do if they're in an abusive relationship, if they're thinking of leaving a relationship, and if they're out of a relationship, right? But I think when we talk about safety guidelines, safety is a big thing. I mean, we have the PAPIA, but we also have AI safety we have to think about, and how accessible are we when it comes to gender-based violence. And that's a topic on its own when we talk about social media and safety and cyberbullying and cyber abuse and all of that, right? But also we have access to protection orders. And again, it's about people knowing about protection orders, how to apply for them. Then as far as the NSM is concerned and shelters are concerned, we don't share the details of shelters. Like we get a lot of people, especially now this time of year, we'll get people wanting to donate. We would inform a shelter or CC, use email addresses and get people directly in touch with the shelter. So we try to preserve the confidentiality. So confidentiality is a big thing. Confidentiality of both the survivors and the confidentiality of the shelter, so that it keeps them safe, and also access to perpetrators. The other thing also that I want to mention when it comes to shelters, and a lot of survivors are also uncomfortable with this, is the phone. And it came up just recently. I was speaking to one of our helpline staff members who mentioned that a woman is working, she needs her phone and her laptop. But the rule is that you're not allowed to keep your phone, because then perpetrators can access a survivor. And when we talk about threat, we're not just talking about the threat to one particular survivor, but also if, let's say, for example, I give access to a perpetrator, what are the implications for the shelter and for the other residents? So there's always, and that is why rules at shelters are so important. And I think people don't always understand that, but it's more, the biggest thing is safety.
That's a big one. I think the rules of the shelter, I think in my penultimate question about those rules, are there survivors who can kind of do a half living in the shelter, half living with family? Is that something that's viable? But also just that process of while they're living in the shelter, what are some things that they can and can't do?
Okay, so shelters, usually the average period that a survivor stays in a shelter is between 3 and 6 months. Ideally, we don't have too many of those in the country, but what we call secondary and tertiary housing, which is that gradual process, which we'll look at in a little bit later, right? But what I want to say about that is that movement is a threat, right? So we do try, amongst the services that shelters also provide is what we call women's economic empowerment, right? Where we can do skills development for women so that when they leave shelters, they can become self-reliant and self-sufficient. So, there are instances like those where we send women to a training provider. Sometimes training is done on site. Sometimes you have to make concessions when it comes to phones and movement. But ideally, we want, again, whatever decisions are taken in the interests of the survivors themselves and the residents of the shelter itself. So, that kind of in and out is a big
No.
discussion.
Yes, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. I mean, the next part that we were going to get to definitely is the transition period. Is there a period where survivors or residents are helped to start living independently, or is it kind of like just a cutoff? This is your 6 months, now go be on your own.
So I mentioned the words healing and recovery, right? Those are long-term processes. They're gradual. It's unrealistic also for us to expect, depending on how long a woman was in an abusive relationship, how do you just undo all of that, right? So the shelter is the beginning of a healing and recovery process. It's a painful one as well. There's lots of reflections. It can be very unpleasant. I think for me, some buzzwords or keywords that came to mind, and I mentioned healing, but also closure, empowerment. It's also a process of building independence, but also making peace with your experience, letting go. It's also meant for you to start functioning more, if I were to say optimally or healthy. It's a process of self-growth. And I mentioned life skills. It's also about acquiring a level of happiness. So that's a lot of stuff. It's a journey. And I think even for people like us, let's say even non-survivors, I mentioned life experiences. These are some things, it's a lifelong journey. We all have to go through it at some point, right? But for a survivor, it's more intense, more painful, it's more gradual. It's also dependent on the kind of support structures that she may or may not have. And that makes a big difference. Does she have anywhere to go? And when we spoke about rules, some shelters often ask for an exit plan when we place a survivor. And that's meant to convey a message that the shelter is not a permanent place. We want to see that the person has given some thought to long-term plans, but also at the same time bearing in mind, we have to treat cases differently. Sometimes a woman is so traumatized when she comes, like when she goes to a police station, and maybe this is a good time to mention that when she goes to a police station, they'll ask, okay, did she get the case details? Did she do this? And sometimes emotionally and mentally, she's just not in the right space. She's not even thinking about her exit plan. But at the same time, for a shelter to understand, because it's very hard. How does a shelter say, okay, like you said, it's 3 months are up, your 6 months are up. Now you have to back up and leave, right? And she doesn't have anywhere to go. So that's where also, and I mentioned support structure. So sometimes shelters also have to do some kind of family reunification. And then also some requirements when I say requirements, I say important things like commitment to the process, consistency. You have to be patient with yourself, I think, when you're going through recovery. And then I think aftercare is important. So remember that when a lot of organizations, VEP organizations, sheltering is sometimes one part of the service that they provide. So they could provide ongoing services to a survivor where they already integrated into the community, but let's say counseling is ongoing. Capacity building or skills development might be something that they could still attend. Support groups might be another intervention that they can use. So yes, so you get sheltering, it starts the process of healing, and then might move on to other services that they could continue receiving from an organization.
Definitely a lot of information we've gotten here. All the reasons that a survivor in hesitation could consider that you will be getting other assistance. It's not just about sheltering. So I would really love if you could please share the different helplines that people can use to get in touch with the NSM. If there is something you could say to one survivor out there wondering, why should I go to a shelter? Why should I get out? How will this help me? What would you say to them?
Okay, so I never thought about it before, but if I had to say, you deserve better. And no one deserves to be beaten, no matter what. Okay, so on that note, I hope that that's a strong message to anyone who is in an abusive relationship. But also just to quickly share our details with you, we have a 24-hour GBV shelter placement service. It's not a counseling service, but we place women who are in abusive relationships. And the toll-free number is 0800 001 005. We also have, you can WhatsApp, you can send please call me or SMSs to 082 057 8600 or 082 058 2215 or 072 230 7147. I know it's a mouthful, but I'm hoping that with all those numbers, you're bound to get through to us.
Thank you so much, Anisa. This was powerful. Thank you.